Okay, so before we get into the second section, the PowerPoint itself, what I want to do is draw your attention in the Blackboard course shell under course content. If you scroll down a little bit to journal information, but after chapter 1, this is where I've got a lot of information. There's the general information about the journals, but then there's something called links to interesting ideas. And if you click on this, I've gone chapter by chapter with videos, articles, blogs. So if we take a look at chapter 2, there are possible journal sources towards the bottom, but the first 3 are more general. I wouldn't ask you to write a journal about this. The first one is a link to a web page, might be a blog, I'm not sure, where the man talks about norms. It's very academic. The next one, I actually would like you to take the mindset quiz. It's 20 questions. It's very quick, and I'd like you to take it, I mean, ideally before you look at this section, but you can do it after you listen to this section. Just take the quiz so you have some information. And then the last link is to Hofstede's model of national culture. The work that let me get out of here. The work that we're going to be looking at in this chapter are based a lot on the work that he did. So what we're looking at now is section number 2, cultural values and norms. And by the end of this, or as you go through this section, I want you to think about this question, so at the end you can actually answer it. What are the 5 key values that help shape a culture's communication norms? And not just what are they, but what do they mean? Okay, this is crucial work in social phenomena. So the biggest one, the first 2 are the big 2, and I think some people say this is the biggest difference, and others people will say it's the next one. In any case, this is major. Okay. Cultures they're on more of a continuum, but I'm going to present this as if it's an all or nothing initially. So just bear with me. Generally, cultures are considered to be either low context or high context cultures. If you think of context as being the situation, like you come in and you say, oh, I can't believe I just heard Michael was swearing at someone, and I'm like, wow, I can't believe that. And then when I say, Michael, I heard you were swearing at someone, he said, well, you need to understand the context. You need to understand the situation. So we use the word context, but I don't know that we always really understand what that means. So a culture that is a low context culture means it's a culture that does not pay a lot of attention to the context. It has a low regard for the context. So people in this culture will use language very directly. They will express their thoughts, feelings, and ideas directly. They feel that it's virtuous to get to the point quickly, that if you don't, you're somehow being dishonest. The opposite end of the spectrum is the high context culture, where people in this culture pay a lot of attention and have high regard for or high reliance on the context. That rather than feeling that they don't feel that they need to use words all the time, they rely on nonverbal cues to maintain social harmony. Okay, so someone from a low context culture looks at someone from a high context culture and says, why don't they just come out and say it? Why are they beating around the bush? Why didn't they tell me they were upset with this? And the person from a high context culture looks at someone from a low context culture and says, why can't this person pick up the subtle cues that I'm giving off? Why are they being so direct? They're being so rude. So there are a lot of misunderstandings between cultures because the norms influence how we communicate. Okay, so you have all, think about this. The United States, on page 44, there's a chart that looks at high versus low context cultures. What are some of the nations that are these two different kinds of cultures? How is important information carried? What do communicators value? And what do communicators admire? So people from the high context culture obviously admire silence, because you should not have to tell someone something. They should just know. Think of the U.S. is overall a low context culture. But what about your family, the family that you grew up in? Was it a low context culture? Were you told, use your words, explain what you mean, don't beat around the bush? Or was it a family where you were expected to pick up on cues, and you weren't expected to have to talk about things? So frequently within the larger culture, there are people who don't fit into that overall culture. We'll talk more about this a little bit later, I think, when we talk about co-cultures. Okay. The next big one is individualism versus collectivism. And these next four are based on the work of Geert Hofstede. Hofstede he just died this past year. He was a Dutch social psychologist. And in the 60s, late 60s, he was hired by IBM. IBM stood for International Business Machine, and IBM, although headquartered, I think, in the United States, had offices, had factories, I can't think of the word, all over the world. And they would develop training, whether it's for people on the floor or for their salesmen, and they realized that things were not working well. What worked in Los Angeles was not working in Beijing, was not working in Moscow, was not working in Johannesburg, wherever they were. And they were saying, okay, what's the issue? So Hofstede, with his background in social psychology, and a bunch of other people went out and they studied. And he came up with originally 4 dimensions of culture. He has since expanded it to 6. He and his son have worked on it, and other people. And I only talk about the first 4 because the last 2 are in this book, and I don't know enough about, but at some point I will. So anyways, if a culture is individualistic, we feel that the primary responsibility each person has is to himself or herself. Right? The primary responsibility is, you're looking out for number 1. In collectivistic culture, an individual's loyalties belong to the group, whatever the group is, the family, the extended family, the larger community, the work organization. So in an individualistic culture, the word is I. And in a collectivistic culture, the word is we. So there's a picture from the Lego movie, which I have not seen, but it has something to do with individualism and collectivism. So if any of you have seen it, that would be great. You could share with the rest of us what's going on in this movie. So anyways, the next slide shows you, and it's not terribly clear, but this is based on Hofstede's work. And actually it's got Jan Hofstede, that's his son. But the darker the color, the more individualistic the country. So you see the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, England, looks like Scandinavia. Actually, I think the United States might be darkest of all. The lighter the color, the more collectivistic the country is. However, those countries that are white, which is a lot of countries in Africa, it's not that they are completely collectivistic. It's that they didn't actually study those cultures. However, let me see if I can show you. Right here, this thing that I always think looks kind of like a turkey leg, that is Niger. That's the country where my husband is from. And it is more collectivistic, even though they didn't study it because IBM doesn't have anything there, I guess. So, what else did I want to tell you about individualism and collectivism? So you can be a member of one culture, a certain culture that is predominantly collectivistic, let's say, but for whatever reason you are more individualistic. People in your culture are going to think that you're selfish. You live in an individualistic culture and you are more collectivistic, and people are going to think you're a sap because you are always taking care of others instead of putting yourself first. Now, I'm presenting this again, as I said earlier, as if it's an either or, and obviously it's always a continuum. Okay. The next one that Hofstede studied or came up with was this idea of power distance. In a culture, do we accept that there's going to be an unequal distribution of power? There are some people who will have power, money, and status, and that is just right and normal, or do we believe that it should be a level playing field, which would be low power distance? So a high power distance, the tendency is to obey authority. In a low power distance, the tendency is to minimize distinction between class and status. This one I find interesting because it puts the U.S. at a very low power distance. And it says, the book tells us, if you think about the Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal. And I don't mean to fan the flames, but I think it kind of said all white men are created equal, and let's not worry too much about women, and let's not worry too much about blacks or Hispanics. Okay, but so within a society, you will see that everyone does not share the same beliefs. But take a look at these cultures that are darker. Soviet Union. Well, it's not Soviet Union anymore. Okay, Russia definitely has that you must obey authority. Saudi Arabia. It looks like Mexico's pretty much more towards high power distance, obeying authority. So India with a caste system where people just accept the fact that society is set up in such a way so that it is not equal. Okay. The next one has to do with uncertainty avoidance, which is the degree to which we as members of society feel that an ambiguous situation, or a situation that's not, it's not definite, it's up in the air. Do we feel threatened by this situation? And because we feel threatened, do we try to avoid them? Now, this one, when I've talked to classes in the past, there's a lot of individual differences. There's a lot of people who feel very high uncertainty avoidance. There's people who suffer from anxiety. They need clear rules and regulations. A low uncertainty avoidance is like, whatever. Whatever happens, that's great. So this is not my background. I'm not a social scientist, even though I find it fascinating. But I suspect that this is one where there's a lot of individual differences within the larger culture. So when I ask students, where do you think the United States falls? People say, it probably falls a little bit more towards the high uncertainty avoidance. And when you look at it, nope, it's pale. Okay, it's saying, yeah, we don't mind. We're okay with uncertain situations. I'm not sure I agree on that one. This is one I think I want to explore on my own a little bit more. Okay, the last one that Hofstede talked about was the idea of an achievement culture versus a nurturing culture. It's also frequently referred to as masculine versus feminine. So an achievement culture, there's a high value on material success, money, status, and a big focus on the task that you have to do. Let's not get bogged down in feelings. Let's just do what we have to do. A nurturing culture, also called a feminine culture, there's a high value placed on relationships and support. So, guesses where the United States falls in here? The United States, although not the highest, is fairly masculine. Right here. Mexico. Now I have to mumble because my knowledge of South America is not great. China, South Africa, Kenya, I know the African continent a little bit better, tend to be higher, more emphasis on status. Okay, I'm surprised that the U.S. is not higher. No big surprise that the Scandinavian countries are more feminine or nurturing, because think about the programs that they have set up there. A lot of social support is built into their society. So overall in this section, the idea is, because these are norms of society, they are going to influence how people communicate. They're going to influence the topics that people talk about. They're going to influence the topics that are just not talked about. They're going to influence the kind of language that is used. So if you haven't done so already, I'd like you to take the quiz on tight or loose culture based on the work of Michelle Gelfand. I actually read the book. Fascinating. And what was I going to say? See if it makes sense to you that, that did it pinpoint how tight or loose you are, and then you might take a look back at these maps and see how much do you adhere tightly or loosely to whatever it is, the culture that you were brought up in. All right, and I'm going to take a break, and I will come back and talk about the next section in a few moments. And